The courtroom was packed. Lawyers, journalists, and members of the public filled the wooden benches, all eager to witness the high-profile case unfold. At the center of it all stood JD Vance, the senator and best-selling author known for his no-nonsense approach and deep understanding of the struggles of everyday Americans. Opposing him was Judge Marcus Holloway, a man with a reputation for being arrogant, dismissive, and at times outright hostile toward those he disagreed with. Many knew him as a judge who loved the sound of his own voice more than the pursuit of justice. From the moment JD Vance walked into the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Judge Holloway barely acknowledged him, only offering a condescending glance before shuffling his papers. "Well, well," the judge drawled, tapping his gavel against the desk. "It's not every day a politician tries to play lawyer. Let's see if Mr. Vance knows his way around a courtroom as well as he knows how to write dramatic sob stories." A few chuckles rippled through the room. JD Vance remained calm, his expression unreadable. He had dealt with men like Holloway before, men who mistook arrogance for intelligence. The case at hand wasn't even about politics. It involved a struggling business owner, Martin Green, who was being crushed under a slew of regulations and unfair practices. Vance had taken an interest in the case because it highlighted everything wrong with the system, how bureaucratic. Red tape often strangled small businesses while favoring the elite. As JD began his argument, outlining the ways in which Green had been unfairly targeted, Judge Holloway smirked, interrupting him mid-sentence. "Spare me the campaign speech, Mr. Vance," Holloway said, leaning back in his chair. "This is a court of law, not a town hall meeting for your supporters." A murmur spread through the courtroom. JD Vance paused, then resumed speaking, unfazed. Holloway wasn't finished. "Tell me, Mr. Vance," he said with mock curiosity, "what law school did you attend again? Oh, that's right. You're not a lawyer. Just another politician playing pretend." The judge's tone dripped with sarcasm, and a few of his cronies in the gallery chuckled again. Vance didn't blink. He met Holloway's gaze and replied, "I may not be a lawyer, Your Honor, but I do know when a judge is abusing his position." The courtroom fell silent. Holloway's smirk wavered for a moment, then returned. "That's quite the accusation. Be careful, Senator, you're not in Washington now." Vance crossed his arms. "No, I'm in a place where justice should be served, not mocked." Judge Holloway's face darkened. "You're walking a fine line, Vance." JD simply nodded. "So are you." Holloway's patience was wearing thin. He turned his attention back to the case, but it was clear he had already made up his mind. Every objection Vance raised was dismissed. Every point he made was interrupted. It was blatant. It was disrespectful. And it was illegal. As the trial progressed, something unexpected happened. A court clerk quietly left the room and returned a few minutes later, slipping a note to a bailiff. The bailiff's eyes widened as he read it, then nodded and stepped out. JD Vance, meanwhile, continued pressing forward despite Holloway's constant interruptions. Then, just as Holloway was about to dismiss another objection with his usual smugness, the courtroom doors swung open. Several federal agents entered, their badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. The entire room turned to stare. Judge Holloway's smirk vanished. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. One of the agents stepped forward. "Judge Marcus Holloway, you are under arrest for corruption, bribery, and obstruction of justice." The courtroom erupted. Gasps and whispers filled the air as Holloway's face turned an unnatural shade of red. "This is ridiculous. I am a judge. You have no right." The agent cut him off. "We have every right. You've been under investigation for months, accepting bribes, intimidating witnesses, suppressing evidence. There's more than enough to convict you." Holloway's mouth opened and closed, his bravado gone. The agents moved in, pulling him up from his seat as he stammered protests. The once mighty judge was now just another criminal in handcuffs. JD Vance watched the scene unfold, his face unreadable. Then he simply said, "Justice still matters in this country." As Holloway was led away, the courtroom was left in stunned silence. What had started as a judge's attempt to humiliate JD Vance had ended with his own downfall. The system, flawed as it was, had prevailed, and Vance had once again proven that standing up to corruption was always worth it. As the agents escorted Judge Holloway out of the courtroom, a stunned silence hung in the air. Lawyers whispered to one another, journalists frantically scribbled notes, and the spectators sat frozen, trying to process what had just happened. The mighty Judge Marcus Holloway, once feared for his arrogance and unchecked power, was now nothing more than another criminal caught in the act. JD. Vance remained standing at the defense table, watching as the man who had tried to humiliate him was led away in handcuffs. He had seen corruption before, but to witness it crumble in real time was something else entirely. Martin Green, the small business owner whose case had brought them here in the first place, turned to JD with wide eyes. "Did you know this was going to happen?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. JD shook his head. "Not exactly," he admitted, "but I had my suspicions." It had started with a few irregularities in the judge's rulings, patterns of decisions that always seemed to favor large corporations over small businesses, bureaucrats over citizens. JD had done his homework. He had quietly asked around, pulled records, and spoken to people who had once stood in the very spot he was standing in now. The picture that emerged wasn't pretty. Holloway wasn't just an arrogant judge. He was a corrupt one. As JD turned back toward the bench, another figure stood up from the prosecutor's side. It was Assistant U.S. Attorney Laura Mitchell, who had been overseeing the case. She stepped forward, clearing her throat. "Well," she said, trying to regain control of the room, "given the circumstances, I believe we'll need to appoint a new judge to oversee these proceedings." A murmur of agreement swept through the courtroom. One of the court clerks, still looking dazed, spoke up. "We should take a brief recess while we get an emergency replacement judge assigned." The bailiff nodded and called out, "All rise." The courtroom stood as everyone processed the surreal moment. Judge Holloway was gone, but the case wasn't over yet. JD turned to Martin and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This isn't just about you anymore," he said. "This case was bigger than we realized." Martin let out a breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "I just wanted to keep my business alive. I never thought I'd be in the middle of something like this." JD gave him a small, confident smile. "That's how corruption works. It thrives in the shadows. People like Holloway count on folks like you being too busy or too afraid to fight back." As the courtroom slowly emptied for the recess, JD walked over to the federal agents who had arrested Holloway. One of them, a no-nonsense man with graying hair and sharp eyes, extended a hand. "Senator Vance," he said. "I'm Agent Ron Keller, FBI. I wanted to thank you." JD raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Keller smirked. "For getting under Holloway's skin just enough for him to make a mistake. We've been building a case against him for months, but today was the final nail in the coffin." JD nodded, glancing toward the doors where Holloway had disappeared. "So, he's been at this for a while?" Keller sighed. "More than a while. Bribes, backroom deals, pressuring attorneys, dismissing cases that should have gone to trial. We suspected him for years, but he covered his tracks well." JD crossed his arms. "Guess he got too comfortable." "That's how it always happens," Keller replied. "They think they're untouchable until they aren't." Before JD could respond, a young woman approached him, one of the journalists who had been watching the case unfold. "Senator Vance," she said, microphone in hand, "do you have a statement on what just happened?" JD considered her question. He knew whatever he said now would be broadcast everywhere. After a brief pause, he spoke. "I think today was proof that the law still matters," he said firmly. "No one is above it. Not politicians, not corporate elites, and certainly not judges who abuse their power. The people who come into these courtrooms deserve real justice, not a system rigged against them. The reporter nodded, quickly jotting down his words. Do you think this case will have a larger impact on the judicial system? JD's expression hardened. It should. Because if people like Marcus Holloway can sit on the bench for years, making decisions that ruin lives while lining their own pockets, then we have a much bigger problem than just one corrupt judge. As the journalist stepped away, Martin approached JD once again. So, what happens now? JD exhaled. Now, we finish what we started. An hour later, the courtroom reconvened with a new judge, one with no ties to Holloway, someone who had been assigned to oversee the case fairly. The atmosphere had changed. People weren't whispering in fear of what Holloway might say or do. There was a sense of relief, of justice finally being restored. JD and his legal team resumed their argument, this time without interruptions, without condescension, and without the game Holloway had been playing. And when the verdict finally came, it was the outcome JD had fought for: fairness, justice, and a victory for Martin Green. As JD walked out of the courtroom that evening, the cameras were still waiting. Reporters bombarded him with questions, but he kept his response simple. Today was a win for the little guy, he said, and a reminder that no matter how powerful someone thinks they are, the truth will always catch up to them. As the sun set over the city, JD Vance walked away, not just with a legal victory, but with proof that standing up to corruption was always worth it. As JD Vance stepped outside the courthouse, the cool evening air was filled with murmurs from the gathered crowd. Reporters, supporters, and even casual onlookers watched him with curiosity and admiration. The events of the day had unfolded in a way no one had expected, and the impact of Judge Holloway's arrest was only beginning to ripple through the legal and political world. Martin Green, the small business owner whose case had brought them here, walked beside JD, his face still, carrying the weight of everything that had happened. I can't believe it's over, he muttered. After everything, after all the times I thought the system was rigged against me, it actually worked. JD smiled slightly. It worked today, but there's a reason people don't always believe in it anymore. Holloway was just one bad judge. There are plenty more like him. Martin nodded. So, what happens to him now? JD glanced toward the courthouse steps, where a few FBI agents were still lingering, talking among themselves. He'll go through the same justice system he thought he controlled. And if there's anything poetic about it, he'll be standing in a courtroom soon, just on the other side of the bench this time. A sudden voice interrupted them. Senator Vance. A quick word? It was another journalist, a middle-aged man with a sharp gaze and a microphone already lifted toward JD's face. Cameras from multiple news networks turned to capture the moment. JD adjusted his stance. He knew how these things worked. Twist the narrative, spin the headlines. He had to be careful with his words. Go ahead, JD said. You've spoken a lot about corruption in the government and judicial system. What do you say to those who believe this was just a one-off incident, that this doesn't reflect a larger issue? JD met the journalist's eyes, unwavering. I'd say they're either naive or willfully blind. This wasn't an accident. Judge Holloway didn't wake up one day and decide to be corrupt. He got away with it for years because no one held him accountable. How many cases did he throw out? How many people lost everything because they never got a fair trial? If we think this is just about him, we're missing the bigger picture. The journalist nodded, scribbling notes. And what do you think the fallout will be from his arrest? JD took a deep breath. I think we'll see exactly how deep this goes. Corruption doesn't happen in a vacuum. Holloway wasn't doing this alone. There will be more names, more cases, and hopefully more accountability, because if we don't clean up the system, we'll just end up with another Holloway taking his place. The journalist asked one final question. Will you be pushing For a broader investigation into judicial corruption? JD's expression hardened. Absolutely. The journalist thanked him and moved on, while JD turned back to Martin. The business owner still seemed overwhelmed by everything. I don't know how to thank you, Martin said. I was ready to give up. I thought guys like Holloway always won. JD clapped him on the shoulder. Not today, Martin, and not if we keep fighting. As JD made his way toward his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from one of his contacts in Washington popped up. We need to talk. There's more to this than just Holloway. JD stared at the screen for a moment, then slipped his phone back into his pocket. He had suspected as much. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. JD Vance sat in the back of his car, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. The weight of the day hung on his shoulders, not just the victory, but the implications. If Judge Holloway had been caught, how many more were still out there? His phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. Go ahead, JD answered, his voice steady. A familiar voice came through the line. It was Mark Reynolds, a longtime investigative journalist who had uncovered major corruption scandals before. JD, I don't know what you did to Holloway, but you just shook a hornet's nest. JD raised an eyebrow. I didn't do anything. To him. He did it to himself. Mark chuckled, but there was no humor in his voice. Maybe, but listen, Holloway wasn't just some greedy judge taking bribes. I've been digging into his financial records. He was part of something bigger. A network. JD's grip on the phone tightened. What kind of network? Mark lowered his voice as if looking over his shoulder. Judges, politicians, corporate elites, you name it. Holloway was just one cog in a machine that's been running for years, maybe decades. He took bribes, yeah, but he also buried cases for the right price, suppressed evidence, let criminals walk free while hammering the little guy, and he wasn't doing it alone. JD's mind raced. He had suspected corruption, but an organized network? That was something else entirely. What are you saying, Mark? JD asked. I'm saying Holloway was protected, Mark said. Until today. His arrest is making a lot of people nervous. If he talks, if the FBI digs deep enough, we could be looking at one of the biggest corruption scandals in years. JD exhaled slowly. So who's protecting them now? There was a pause on the other end. That's the problem, Mark said. They're scrambling. Some will try to cover their tracks, others might turn on each other. And a few? They'll come after you. JD's jaw clenched. He had dealt with political enemies before, but this felt different. It wasn't just a fight over policies or elections. This was about power, money, and control at the highest levels. Let them try, JD said. I didn't come this far to back down now. Mark sighed. I figured you'd say that. Just watch your back, Senator. The call ended, but JD's mind was already racing. If what Mark said was true, this was bigger than just one corrupt judge. This was a system designed to protect itself at all costs. And now, thanks to Holloway's downfall, that system had a crack in it. JD wasn't just going to sit back and watch. He was going to widen that crack until the whole thing came crashing down. He pulled out his phone again, scrolling through his contacts. It was time to make some calls of his own, because if the corrupt elites thought this was over, they were dead wrong. This fight was just